Robert Sterling, 72 years old with an $800 million fortune, entered the Michelin-starred restaurant Le Bernardin dressed like any ordinary retiree, worn cardigan, baggy pants, scuffed shoes, and a walking cane to complete the disguise. He wanted to test his son Alexander before leaving him the family industrial empire, but never imagined that evening would forever shatter the image he had of the boy raised in unlimited luxury. From his corner table, Robert watched Alexander laugh and joke with his wealthy friends while pointing at and mocking the less elegant customers, unaware that among them was his own disguised father. When the waiter brought the $3,000 check, Alexander didn't hesitate to publicly humiliate the poor old man sitting alone, accusing him of being a deadbeat who couldn't afford such a place. What Alexander didn't know was that this deadbeat had built with his own hands the empire Alexander considered his birthright. And what Robert never imagined was that this evening he would discover he had raised a monster instead of an heir, unleashing a chain of events that would forever change the destiny of both of them. Robert Sterling sat in the leather chair of his office, looking through the panoramic window at the industrial empire he had built from nothing over 50 years of work. Sterling Industries stretched endlessly across the Ohio countryside, employing 20,000 people and producing automotive components for half of North America. But at 72, with his heart beginning to show signs of strain, Robert knew the time had come to decide who would inherit everything. Alexander, 32 years old, was his only son, raised between Swiss private schools, American universities, and a golden life that Robert never could have dreamed of as a young man. The old entrepreneur had always hoped that behind the privileges, his son had also inherited the values that had guided him through life: respect for those who work, humility toward the less fortunate, understanding that money is a tool, not an end. But in recent years, Robert's doubts had grown. Alexander ran the company's marketing division without particular passion, more interested in society parties and luxury travel than production dynamics. He spoke of workers as numbers in a balance sheet, suppliers as obstacles to overcome, customers as wallets to empty. Robert wondered if his son truly understood the weight of responsibility he was about to inherit. The idea came to him one evening while flipping through an old photo album depicting his youth as a factory worker. Robert was born into a poor family in Cleveland, started working at 14 as a laborer in a factory, studied evenings after 12-hour shifts. The first capital to start his company came from selling his parents' house and working 3 years without salary. He had known fatigue, the fear of not making ends meet, the dignity of those who break their backs for an honest paycheck. Alexander had never experienced any of this. He had grown up in a golden bubble that protected him from the world's reality, and Robert feared he had created an heir incapable of understanding the people he would have to lead. He decided to test him, but in a way his son would never imagine. The chosen evening was Alexander's birthday, when he had organized dinner at Le Bernardin with his high society Manhattan friends. Robert called the owner, an old friend he had known for years, and organized everything down to the smallest detail. He would present himself disguised as a modest retiree, observe his son's behavior toward those he considered lower class, and then draw his conclusions. The morning of the test, Robert looked at himself in the mirror while putting on clothes he had bought specifically for the occasion. A faded and slightly worn blue cardigan, shapeless gray pants, black shoes that were worn but still clean, a walking cane he had taken from storage. The image the mirror reflected was that of an ordinary man, one of millions of American retirees making do with what they have. As he headed to the restaurant, Robert thought maybe he was overreacting, that Alexander was a good kid who deserved trust. But part of him, the part forged by the difficult years of the beginning, whispered that a true leader must be tested before receiving power. And if Alexander failed the test, Robert was prepared to completely revise his inheritance plans. He never imagined that evening he would discover a truth that would destroy all his certainties as a father. Le Bernardin was one of those places that whispered luxury from every detail. Waterford crystal chandeliers, Irish linen tablecloths, silver cutlery reflecting the soft candlelight. Robert entered limping slightly, leaning on his cane and looking around with the somewhat bewildered expression of someone unaccustomed to such environments. The maitre d' welcomed him with professional courtesy, but Robert noticed the quick glance that assessed his modest clothing. He was escorted to the table he had reserved, strategically positioned to have a perfect view of Alexander's table, who hadn't yet arrived with his group. Robert ordered the most economical menu available and began waiting, pretending to read a financial newspaper while actually studying every detail of the environment. He knew that restaurant as owner of several shares, but tonight he saw it through the eyes of an ordinary customer, noticing details he usually didn't catch. The way staff treated customers differently based on their appearance, the waiter's whispers, the judgmental looks of some patrons. At exactly 8 o'clock, Alexander arrived with his group, 8 young people between 25 and 35, all dressed in Armani and Tom Ford, all with that air of confidence that only family money can provide. Alexander wore a navy suit that Robert recognized because he had given it to him for his previous birthday. It cost more than a factory worker's annual salary. His son sat at the table with his back to Robert, but the old entrepreneur could clearly hear the conversations thanks to his chosen position. The first minutes were normal. Jokes among friends, discussions about summer trips just finished, gossip about Manhattan high society. Alexander appeared relaxed and likable, the kind of person Robert hoped he had raised. But then began the first comments that froze the blood in his father's veins. One of Alexander's friends pointed out an elegant but not young man sitting alone. Alexander looked at him with superiority and commented that he was probably one of those new money types trying to buy respect with expensive clothes. The group laughed, and someone added that you could tell from a mile away he didn't belong in their world. Robert gripped his cane tighter, but the worst was yet to come. Alexander began making a ruthless review of the restaurant's other customers, commenting on everyone with a cruelty his father had never heard from him. An elderly lady was dismissed as an old cat putting on airs, a middle-aged couple as provincials playing rich for one night, a young entrepreneur as a social climber who reeks of new money. Robert felt every word like a stab to the heart. The son he had raised, educated, and loved was showing a side of himself the father didn't know. Arrogant, contemptuous, incapable of seeing humanity in people he considered inferior. But the final blow was yet to come. Around 9:30, while Robert pretended to have difficulty reading the menu by bringing it closer to and farther from his eyes, as elderly people often do, he heard Alexander say something that made him startle. He was telling his friends how he had fired 3 workers the previous week, not for economic reasons, but because he couldn't stand their loser faces. He laughed while describing their desperation, imitating the Cleveland accent of the foreman who had begged for his men. Robert closed his eyes and for a moment saw himself 40 years earlier, also a worker, with the same accent his son now mocked, with the same wounded dignity that Alexander found so amusing to imitate. In that moment, he understood the test was already giving its results, but not the ones he had hoped for. The evening continued with Alexander warming up more and more, probably due to the expensive wine he kept ordering. His comments became sharper, crueler, more devoid of any trace of humanity. Robert listened petrified, realizing that the son he thought he knew was actually a stranger. Alexander began recounting episodes from his work life that his father had never heard. How he had refused a raise to administration employees because he thought they were already too spoiled. How he enjoyed making small suppliers wait for hours in his office before receiving them, just to make clear who was in charge. how he had transferred workers who dared complain about working conditions to more demanding departments. Every word was a punch to Robert's stomach, who watched the image he had built of his son crumble. Alexander wasn't the good boy who was a bit spoiled that he had imagined, but a being devoid of empathy who used the power given by birth to humiliate those who couldn't defend themselves. The most atrocious moment came when Alexander noticed Robert struggling to cut his meat with slightly trembling hands. As often happens to elderly people, instead of feeling compassion or simply ignoring him, Alexander pointed him out to his friends, laughing loudly. "Look at that old guy," he said loudly enough to be heard by nearby tables. "I bet he wandered in here by mistake and now doesn't know how to pay the bill. He probably thought it was one of those $2 diners that retirees frequent." His friends laughed, but Robert saw that some seemed a bit uncomfortable. Alexander, however, didn't stop. He got up from the table and approached Robert with his glass in hand, swaying slightly from the alcohol. The old entrepreneur kept his gaze down, continuing to pretend to be what he appeared. Alexander stopped next to his table and spoke to him in a patronizing and offensive tone. Robert felt the heat of rage rise in his throat, but managed to maintain control. With a trembling voice, like that of an intimidated elderly man, he murmured that he had the right to be there, like everyone else. Alexander's response was chilling. The group of friends burst into cruel laughter that filled the entire restaurant. Robert finally raised his eyes and looked his son straight in the face. For a moment, Alexander seemed struck by the dignity and sadness he saw in those eyes, but alcohol and arrogance prevailed. In that moment, Robert understood the test was over, and Alexander had failed in the most spectacular way possible. His son wasn't just a spoiled young man, he had become a despicable human being who used privilege to trample the weak. And the most painful thing—
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
—was that he was doing it in front of the father who had raised him, without even recognizing him. Robert remained seated at his table for another 20 minutes after the public humiliation, pretending to still be the intimidated elderly retiree, while inside him a silent tragedy was consuming itself. He watched Alexander return to his friends and continue laughing, recounting the episode as a personal triumph, imitating the trembling voice his father had used to defend himself. The old entrepreneur paid his modest bill and left the restaurant, still limping and leaning on his cane. But instead of going home, he stopped at a blue-collar bar in the suburbs, one of those places where normal people gathered after work. He sat in a dark corner and ordered a whiskey, the first he had drunk in years for non-celebratory reasons. While drinking slowly, Robert thought back over Alexander's entire life. Where had he gone wrong as a father? When had this transformation process begun that had created a monster instead of the heir he dreamed of? Perhaps by protecting him too much from difficulties, giving him everything without ever making him understand the value of what he had. Perhaps by not telling him often enough about his humble origins, the effort it had cost to build the empire Alexander considered a birthright. Robert remembered when Alexander was a child, sweet, curious, full of questions about the world and people. What had happened to that child? When had he transformed into the cruel young man he had encountered that evening? The old entrepreneur realized he had no answers, and this made him feel like the greatest failure of his life. Back home in his Westchester estate, Robert sat in his study and made a decision that would change everything. He opened the safe and pulled out the will he had drawn up 2 years earlier, the one that left everything to Alexander. With a steady hand, he tore it up and threw it in the fireplace, watching it burn completely. Then he took paper and pen and began writing a new will, completely different from the previous one. Alexander would inherit only a small sum, sufficient to live with dignity, but not to maintain the lifestyle he had always known. The rest of the fortune would go to a charitable fund managed by a group of managers Robert had selected over the years. all coming from the company's lowest ranks and risen through merit. But Robert didn't stop there. He decided Alexander needed to know why he had lost the inheritance, needed to understand what he had done wrong. The next day, he called his son and told him to come to the office for an important conversation. He didn't tell him what it was about, but the tone of voice suggested it wasn't good news. That night, Robert didn't sleep. He walked through the empty house. His wife had died 10 years earlier, thinking about how he would confront Alexander. Part of him still hoped there was an explanation, that what he had seen was just a moment of weakness. But another part, the one forged by 50 years of difficult decisions, already knew there were no justifications for what he had witnessed. At dawn, Robert made another decision. He wouldn't limit himself to changing the will. He would give Alexander one last chance at redemption, but under conditions his son would never imagine. If Alexander wanted even to hope to regain his father's trust, he had to be willing to start over from the bottom, exactly as Robert had done 50 years earlier. It was a risky bet, but Robert knew it was the only possibility to save not only the inheritance, but also his son's soul. The next day, Alexander showed up at his father's office with the air of someone expecting another lecture about company values. He wore his usual expensive suit and had that slightly bored expression Robert knew well. He sat across from the desk, as he had done thousands of times, not imagining it would be the last time in that position. Robert wasted no time on preambles. With a calm but firm voice, he began recounting what had happened the previous evening. Alexander looked at him, initially confused, then increasingly worried, as he understood where the conversation was heading. When Robert reached the part about his public humiliation, his son's face became pale as a sheet. The old entrepreneur pulled out the ashes of the burned will and poured them on the desk. Alexander looked incredulously at those remains, beginning to understand the scope of what was happening. Robert explained that he had destroyed the will that made him universal heir, and had drawn up a very different new one. Alexander tried to defend himself, to explain, to promise he would change, but Robert was no longer listening. He had made his decision, and nothing in the world would make him reconsider. However, he offered his son one last chance, a path to redemption Alexander would never have expected. Robert proposed he work for 6 months as a factory worker in the family business, with the same salary and hours as everyone else. He had to live on what he earned, without financial help from the family. He had to learn what it meant to wake up at 5 in the morning, do 8 hours of physical work, come home tired with dirty hands. He had to understand what it meant to respect those who earn their living through hard work. After long minutes of silence, Alexander accepted, not out of conviction or desire for redemption, but from desperation and hope of being able to convince his father to reconsider. Robert looked at him and immediately understood his son's motivations were wrong, but decided to give him the chance anyway. Sometimes wisdom comes even through paths that begin with wrong intentions. The following Monday, Alexander Sterling, former executive of the family company, showed up at 6 in the morning at the factory gates, wearing work clothes and safety boots, ready to begin the most difficult journey of his life. Alexander's first days at the factory were hell. His body, accustomed to exclusive gyms and relaxing massages, couldn't handle the pace of manual labor. His hands filled with blisters, his back ached after every shift, and the 5 a.m. alarm seemed like medieval torture. But the worst wasn't the physical fatigue, it was the social isolation. The workers recognized him, knew who he was, and initially treated him with the suspicion reserved for management spies. Alexander realized many of them had suffered from his corporate decisions, personnel cuts, punitive transfers, denied raises. Now he was in the weakest position, and many were tempted to give him a taste of his own medicine. But slowly, week after week, something began to change. Alexander discovered that Joe, the foreman he had mocked for his Cleveland accent, was a man of great practical wisdom who knew how to keep a group of 20 people united with respect and competence. Susan, The cleaning lady he had always ignored proved to be an inexhaustible source of human stories and common sense. Mike, the skilled worker he had transferred to a more demanding department, showed infinite patience in teaching him the trade secrets. The turning point came after 3 months, when Alexander injured his hand on a piece of metal sheeting. Instead of mocking him or ignoring him, his co-workers helped him, treated the wound, covered his work until he recovered. It was the first time in his life he had received selfless help from people who had nothing to gain from his well-being. Alexander began to understand what his father had tried to teach him for 30 years, without success. Work had a dignity that went beyond salary. People had value that wasn't measured by bank accounts. Respect was earned through daily behavior, not titles or inheritance. At home in the evenings, in the small suburban apartment he had rented with his factory wages, Alexander began reading the books about company history his father had written over the years. He discovered a Robert he had never known. The young worker who studied at night after 12-hour shifts, the entrepreneur who knew every employee by name, the man who had built an empire without ever forgetting where he came from. After exactly 6 months, Alexander presented himself again in his father's study. But this time he was different. Thinner, darker from sun and labor, with calloused hands, and in his eyes a light Robert hadn't seen since childhood. He didn't apologize with words, but with facts. He presented a detailed project to improve working conditions in the factory, based on the direct knowledge he had acquired. Robert looked at his son and finally saw the man he had always hoped to raise. Not the arrogant, privileged person of 6 months earlier, but someone who had learned the value of hard work, respect for those who labor, the humility of those who know they must earn everything. The new will remained unchanged. The main inheritance still went to the charitable fund. But Robert created a different role for Alexander. Not owner of the company, but guardian of its values. Alexander would work as human resources director, with the task of ensuring no employee would ever again be treated as he himself had done in the past. 5 years later, when Robert died peacefully in his sleep, the company was stronger than ever. Alexander had transformed Sterling Industries into a model of worker respect, and the charitable fund had created hundreds of jobs for young people from less privileged classes. At the funeral, alongside the executives and businessmen in dark suits, there were hundreds of workers in blue overalls, sincerely mourning the boss who had never forgotten them. Alexander, through his tears, understood this was the true patrimony his father had left him. Not money, but the respect of those he had learned to consider family. The evening of the burial, Alexander returned to Le Bernardin, but this time not to celebrate, but to publicly apologize to all the staff for his behavior years earlier. And when he left, he didn't take the Lamborghini he had to sell, but the bus that took him home to the working-class neighborhood where he had chosen to continue living, because he had finally understood that true inheritance isn't measured by what you receive, but by what you leave for others. Like, if you believe every father should test their children, comment, which lesson struck you most in this story? Share to inspire those who think privileges shouldn't be questioned. Subscribe for more stories of courageous fathers and sons finding their way. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover who you really are. Sometimes a father's love manifests in the moment that's hardest to accept. And sometimes true wealth is found when you stop looking for it in the wrong places. Because the greatest inheritance you can leave a child isn't money, but the values to earn it.